Hello, everyone. Our group is the Bilingual Education Group, and it will be Phil, Kinley, and Lindy, myself. And our topic started out kind of as an overarching idea of bilingual education and some of the programs that fall under that category. And then after some research, we ultimately narrowed it down to examining the research for dual language education. And some of our process, for obtaining articles, like I mentioned, we started out kind of broad. And we found a great meta-analysis by Willig that was kind of our springboard for finding articles and sort of expanding our thoughts on the topic of bilingual education. And through Willig, we did find some other meta-analyses that were beneficial. But we also did a lot of tracing forward and tracing backward. When we traced forward, we primarily used Google Scholar, which was really beneficial for us to kind of find out about the current research and where bilingual education is in this decade and kind of in the classrooms, in the country as it is currently. However, we did do some tracing backward, and through tracing backward, we found a lot of foundational pieces of research and things that really set the foundation for bilingual education programs, as far as the purposes and how they're implemented. So that gave us a really great foundation to start our thoughts about bilingual education programs, and then tracing forward on Google Scholar kind of allowed us to pare it down and sort of narrow our thoughts about what is currently being used in classrooms. And as a part of that process and tagging and including articles in Zotero, that's sort of when we discovered that it would be in the best interest of research to really narrow our topic from bilingual education programs in general to one specific type of bilingual education program. And that's when we landed on dual language education as the program that we were going to do our literature review on and kind of really examine research that was specific to that topic.
Right. So we started with a big chain of questions. At first, we saw in the John Hattie article that bilingual education might not be that much more beneficial than other things to raise student achievement and that sort of thing. So we were all interested in bilingual education and thought, well, how effective is it really? What forms are considered more effective than others? And what is really the best for English language learners, also called ELLs? So we started looking, and as Lindy explained, dual immersion tended to be something that was researched quite a bit. And we had to look, why is it so controversial? There were studies that were very polarized, some greatly in favor of it, some very against it. And this varied from state to state. And so we thought, well, is the legislation involved? What does legislation say about bilingual education? And how is funding dispersed to it? And who makes decisions about dual language programs? That led to other questions, including the implementation. And a lot of studies that we found talked about the implementation about the program, whether the perceptions were positive or negative for bilingual education, and what people really felt like it was doing in their schools. There was also quantitative research as well that would study some of the effects, especially as regards to student achievement and in English and language arts, but also in math and other subjects at times, to see how effective this language instruction method might be. We discovered that location really mattered a lot. That was one of our big emerging themes. Different states have the choice to implement different programs, and California and Arizona, for example, states that had originally had bilingual programs that were fairly large, passed propositions that would limit some of this bilingual education. So we found that the location of the studies really affected the kinds of results or the kinds of studies that could even be conducted in the first place. Another big theme that emerged was just the controversy of dual immersion or dual language education. And we wondered about this and researched, and I think there is still controversy about it, although a lot of emphasis has been positive in the most recent years. The research has been showing more positive trends for bilingual education, specifically dual immersion. And another theme that we noticed was a lot of qualitative research existed. Again, perhaps to examine those perceptions and to figure out why it was more effective. Not just to say it was, but to dig into what exactly was happening in those school scenarios to help students more. Some studies looked at the cognitive effects, but some also looked at the non-cognitive effects. We found several studies that looked at the social and the cultural aspects of it, power dynamics that arose because of language, or if dual language was not encouraged as a form of education, was it actually a form of oppression for a language minority, or we learned they could be called non-dominant language speakers. These are some of the different themes that emerged that led into some of the different types of research that was conducted and the different strategies and methods.
Yeah, so just talking about some of those trends with regards to the sampling, for a lot of the qualitative studies that we did see a lot of convenience sampling. I think that's something that is probably quite common within the research surrounding, language studies, because of the populations are different wherever you go. The funding may not be there because it is something, as we said, that changes as the political landscape changes. You can often feel that some of these programs are at the whim of the politicians that are in power. So there are funding implications, and those geographical factors as well. A study that takes place in California might not be relevant, in Wisconsin, for example. There are also some extreme case samples, some very small samples taking place, which were mainly examples of very good or very bad schools, and very good and very bad dual immersion programs. So this in itself has some issues with regards to the generalization of the studies, makes them very difficult to apply to wider target audiences. And then some of the quantitative ones that we looked at, quite a few of them followed a quasi-experimental design, meaning there was non-random assignment, which actually we saw to be something of a strength, because in a research field such as this, you want to have non-random assignment. You need purposeful sampling to see how the effects of the programs affect specific pupils. The data collection largely took place in the form of interviews and observations for those qualitative studies, and standardized tests and other tasks for the quantitative studies. There was some triangulation with other documents and policy. And also those qualitative studies were mainly ethnographic studies and case studies in specific bilingual programs, which is good because it can give more understanding on a topic. The qualitative methods obviously are clearly to gain greater knowledge about something, whereas those quantitative methods we felt were more to do with comparing and contrasting and finding the best ideas.
And some of what Phil said really lends itself to the strengths and weaknesses of the research. And many of the strengths are things that Phil already mentioned. The methods, for the most part in the research, were authentic. It really mimicked a classroom environment. So even though that meant that it was not conducted in what is necessarily considered a controlled environment, pulling in some of that quasi-experimental design, it really was authentic research that was practical and applicable to classrooms. Additionally, we found that a lot of the researchers were upfront about any of the confounding variables that might be present. So whether that is, absenteeism in the students who are part of the study, or fire drills, or all those things that happen in classrooms that, we as teachers, there's just not much you can do about. Many of the researchers were very honest about identifying those variables, and they had identified strategies, to help kind of combat some of those. So whether that was, omitting students who were absent for a portion of the study from analyzing the results, or students who may have had some of their study interrupted from any type of activity maybe weren't included in the final analysis of the results. But as is true with quasi-experimental research, and being truly taking place in a classroom, the researchers did what they could to kind of combat those things and make it work and make it authentic and valid. So that was a big strength that we noticed through the research.
Yeah, I think something else that we found as well was that for the most part, the methods selected by the researchers were appropriate for the objective of their research. And if in their rationale they're telling us that they're looking to discover more about something or gain a better understanding of a particular program, then they were tending to use qualitative research, interviews and observations rather than quantitative measures. So I think that was also a strength.
Absolutely. Something that was unique to the quantitative studies that were conducted, even though there were fewer of them, was that they all used very popular measures in terms of standardized tests. They picked things that already had high internal validity and tests that were already being assessed or administered to students, so that they could even look at longitudinal data very easily that way. A few of the studies that were longitudinal really showed a lot specific to bilingual education, which is that sometimes the effects of bilingual education take an extended amount of time. So the studies that were longitudinal were a lot stronger and held more credibility. However, not all were, and that was definitely a weakness in the studies that just looked at a few data points and did not triangulate as effectively as they could have.
Yeah, and I think again the sample size that we spoke of, a lot of the studies had very small sample sizes, which in itself isn't necessarily a problem. The problem arises when you start to try and infer causality or to try and expand those results into wider populations. It would be irresponsible for somebody to read a study with a very small sample size, or perhaps one school or one district, and then try and apply that nationwide, and particularly in a country as large and as diverse as this one.
And something else that was very true of the research that Kinley and Phil had touched on a little bit, the location factor really did come into play in a lot of the studies and a lot of the literature that we reviewed. It depended, that ultimately affected the standardized assessments that were chosen. It affected the policies and the programs that were chosen, because what is similar in Pennsylvania is maybe not necessarily what is the same in another state. And so for that reason, as Phil noted, the ability to transfer the studies and the research is a little bit more difficult because bilingual education as a whole does have some limitations, by the legislation and the policies. And so in the research and in the literature that we analyzed, we noticed that transferability and generalizability were a big difficult factor for a lot of those reasons.
For sure, and I mean that created some of the issues we had with the politics of the thing as well. I mean, for certain, Russell and Baker, who are very outspoken against bilingual education and dual immersion strategies. I think Russell herself was quite instrumental in bringing Prop 227 around in California to ban all bilingual programs and use only English immersion. A lot of her research, as we found out by reading some other research, by reading Cummins, was undertaken in French Canada, where it's a completely different system. And it seemed that there was a clear agenda within the research that she was writing. So researcher bias was something else that did arise as an issue for us once or twice.
Absolutely. It was actually interesting to see in the literature reviews that previewed each study that they would argue and criticize each other up and down, and we saw the same names occurring, such as Russell, Baker, Cummins, Ralstad, where they would just accuse each other of bias and really be critical, saying that there were political agendas or that methodologies were not sound when we examined them and could see some merits on both sides, could see the arguments, but overall we felt that the bilingual education really did have a lot of merits. And that was really nice for me to hear personally as an ESL teacher. I am always eager to interact with my students and support them in their home languages, and a way to do that is to use some of their native languages in my classroom. So I felt very affirmed that dual immersion can be an effective strategy, and that a lot of the research does support it, because now, even though I teach in an ESL environment, just pull out or maybe push in English-only instruction traditionally, that I feel that I could give some Spanish instruction, or I could encourage the use of a student's native language, if other means allowed, in order to support their learning, because many of the studies have shown, especially in the first year that a student is learning English or arriving in the country, that it's very helpful for them to be able to use that first language while they're learning the second language.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that a lot of the research did have practical implications for me, and the theoretical concerns, it's very tough to say, because as I think some of the researchers alluded, there's a lot that is yet unknown, and depending on the school and the implementation of the program, bilingual education can look very different in different environments and be more or less effective depending on a lot of different variables and factors.
So we welcome your questions or thoughts in the thread below, and we'd love to hear your thoughts or answer any questions that you might have.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and see you on the other side.
See you later.
Thank you.